to introduce our three wonderful panelists who will talk about Baltimore's garment industry, past, present, and future. We'll kick off the program with an overview of the history of the needle trades and how they took root here in Baltimore in the 19th century from Jack Burkert, who is a senior museum educator here at the BMI. Next, we'll hear from Sally DeMarco, fashion director of SEW Bromo, who will talk about her involvement in the BMI's Garment Loft exhibition. And Sally, I have to say, just as a secret, that is my favorite exhibition in the museum. I just think it's so evocative. It's my favorite. So. And then finally, we'll hear from Stacy Stube, fashion designer and founder of the Elsa Fitzgerald fashion brand, who will share insights into the revitalization of Baltimore as a hub for garment design and manufacturing today. Not sure what's going on with those lights. Stacy's also the director of innovation at Fashions Unlimited, so you'll hear about that too. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for your questions. I have some questions too, but I'm hoping that the questions will primarily come from you because we want to hear from you. Once we wrap up here, we invite you to head into the Garment Loft exhibition, where both Sally and Stacy have some of their garments they're working on set up. And the panelists will also be on hand for continued conversation. And we'll also be joined by a couple of other artists and instructors from SEW Bromo who will be talking about their work. The Garment Loft exhibition, for those of you who may not know, is a reproduction of a 1920s garment factory representing the industry during its heyday. At that time, Baltimore was the 5th largest producer of men's clothing in the nation, I think. Yeah? Okay. With hundreds of manufacturers and contractors employing many thousands of workers. As you'll hear from Jack, the industry declined in the post-World War II period. And today, all of those old garment factories that were once an important part of the landscape on the west side of downtown are gone or have been converted to other uses. But I think that of all the industries that have come and gone in Baltimore, the garment industry has in some ways had one of the more resilient through lines. It doesn't look anything like it used to when it was the largest employer in the city, and people toiled in dangerous, crowded sweatshops. But the needle trades are still a really important part of our identity. And while Under Armour may get the lion's share of attention, it's the smaller shops, the startups, and the innovators who I think are putting Baltimore's garment trade on the map today. So now I invite our panelists to talk about that evolution, and then again, we'll have time for your questions afterwards. Jack Burkert will start us off.
Thank you, Anita. Good afternoon, everyone. We're happy to be here, and I'd like to share about 150 years of history in the next 9 or 10 minutes, okay? So hold on. If you really trace the history of the garment industry in Baltimore, you're really talking about something that really started in the 1830s, 1840s with the immigrant population. Baltimore had a unique situation in that particular period, and all through the 19th century, in that there was a wonderful joining of certain elements that were necessary to create a garment industry. And one of them was, of course, the talent, the immigrants that had come from Europe, bringing their trades with them. Some of them, of course, were silversmiths and all sorts of other things, but many of them were tailors. So they started tailor shops here in Baltimore, and that began, but that wasn't the only element. We then had additional immigrants coming, which provided a labor force, which meant that you could, in fact, grow your business relatively easily by hiring people that were looking for work as they arrived in America. So between the talent and the additional labor force, we also had the cotton crops coming north and that kind of thing, woven into cloth. We had the Jones Falls Valley creating fabric. All of these things mattered here. So suddenly we were in a unique place for a garment industry to arise here. As opposed to any other city that you might have said, well, why not Pittsburgh or something like that? We had this unique opportunity. So that's certainly part of it. I count the beginning of the big industry in 1850 when Elias Howe created a sewing machine. And that really changed everything. Suddenly, it was no longer a hand operation. It didn't have to be a hand operation, although some of the companies held out for quite a while. They said, well, hand is so much better than machines. Sound familiar? And that sort of thing. So, but in 1850, ready-to-wear clothing off machines became a thing, okay? And that began the process. It was sped up in Baltimore by, once again, a fluke of geography, in that when the Civil War came along 10 years later or so, the next thing you know, we're getting orders for uniforms. We're getting uniforms for soldiers. Aha, men's clothing, magic moment. Men's clothing being made in Baltimore for the North, but of course we're a border state and we had a lot of Southern sympathies, so there was a lot of gray uniforms going south at the same time. Taking no chances, of course, right? We saw the opportunity. So we end up with a thriving industry that grows magically through the rest of the century, up until the 1920s, 1930s, where it began to have a little bit of cracks in the facade of industry. Now, companies that were formed in this period, 1850s. Henry Sonnenborn. Henry Sonnenborn was a Jewish immigrant who had been a peddler and started a company. His building is over on the west side of downtown. It's at Paca and Pratt. It's massive, and it was capable of producing 3,000 suits a day. Not that they necessarily had the orders, but that was part of the process. Henry Sonnenborn was known worldwide in the Jewish community for the simple reason that if you were a Jewish person being persecuted in some place, and you could get out and come to America, and you could come to Baltimore, then you could in fact be assured that you would have a reception here for you, that the community would welcome you, and Henry Sonnenborn would make sure that you were employed, that he would give you a job. So this was sort of a lure to bring folks to America. Levi Greif started as a retailer in the late 1850s, started making suits in Baltimore. His was one of the last companies to go into final decline in the late 2/3 of the way through the 20th century. But Levi Greif, by the way, Levi Greif was the only one of the West Side garment manufacturers who got burned out in the 1904 fire. He had the unfortunate position of being close enough to the Hearst building and where the wind was blowing that his place burned down, which is why he ended up with 2 additional locations. Sonnenborn built and stayed where he was. And then of course you got Charles Banks. Charles Banks in the 1890s said to his grandson Joe, "Hey Joe, come over here and do some sewing for us, okay?" And the next thing you know, you have Joseph A. Banks and company. So that's certainly part of it. Immigrants worked on the west side of downtown. They also worked on the east side. The high-rise factory business on the west side of downtown was literally the high-rise business, and it included all sorts of men's suits primarily. There was women's clothing, but not a whole lot of it. Umbrellas and ties and shoes, and you name it, all of it was being made on the west side. And I'm sure you'll see lots of exhibits today that will give you an indication of the kinds of things that were being made. I personally prefer the umbrella window we have in the hall that way as being the finest window in the whole museum. That's my favorite, okay? So have a look at that. I think it's fascinating. But there was a parallel industry in Baltimore. The east side of town was the sweatshop district, okay? There was no question that work was coming through or filtering or originating in the sweatshop community. And there were a couple hundred of sweatshops. And when we say sweatshops, we literally mean overcrowded, stuffy, unhealthy, very, very difficult places with low wages and horrible working conditions, to a point where the city of Baltimore investigated and began a campaign around 1900 to stamp them out, to put a stop to them. So, but that was the east side. Now, you need to understand that this had an effect on the labor force, and this will play out in the 1920s and 1930s. Because what's happening is that the high-rise regular factory workers on the west side are earning a living, but they're seeing some of the work that they might have depended upon for hours in the factory going over to the east side where it was a lot cheaper to do the work. And so suddenly they were losing hours, and the east siders were starving over there anyway, and this led to some labor management issues. And suddenly you had the rise of unions. The labor union movement had not really been a big factor in Baltimore in the garment industry in the 1870s, 1880s in its first iteration. But by 1920 or so, there was a real head-knocking occasion. Henry Sonneborn made peace with the unions. He had a tough time doing it because there were two unions, and they were competing for members. The United Garment Workers was the traditional union for the workers. Unfortunately, the members didn't feel like they were being represented properly, and so what happened was that they formed another union, the Amalgamated, and Sonneborn really didn't quite know who to negotiate with, to be honest with you, because each side had its own thing. The workers were competed in those two unions, and the next thing you know, they were at each other. Not only did Sonneborn stand back and say, I don't know what to do, but the unions are fighting one another right along, and so the process of them battling, literally battling in Sonneborn's factory, we called it the Scissors War, because that's exactly what it was. People went to the hospital, were injured in this process. It spilled out into the streets. Riot police were called. So it was a very difficult time. But Henry Sonneborn worked very hard to make peace with his workers. Other companies didn't make peace very well. Greif did not make peace for a long, long time, and other companies along the way. So the trade unions were certainly part of the process. The problem we had began in World War II when the anticipated orders for soldiers' uniforms never came to Baltimore. We had always had the high points of men's clothing through history with the various wars along, starting with Civil War, first Spanish-American and First World War and all of those things, and we expected, the garment industry expected to thrive, and it did not. Baltimore's a labor-critical area, and we could build ships here, we could make steel, and we could make airplanes here, and we didn't have enough workers for it. So literally the government began to starve out the factories, the garment industry, in World War II period, did not give them orders. Instead, those orders might have gone to Pittsburgh or Cleveland or St. Louis or someplace like that, where they didn't have those facilities, forcing workers to move into other fields, such as becoming a Rosie the Riveter, for example, and those kinds of things. So that's the World War II story. After the war, the industry began to resurrect itself. It was a different industry by then. It was multiple kinds of clothing and that kind of thing. But it never really, it had a renaissance, and that renaissance lasted for just a little while. That renaissance lasted until somebody noticed that for my worker in Baltimore was being paid $10 an hour, there was a lady in Mexico who would do that similar work for 50 cents an hour. And that work began to go away. And that was the beginning of a decline. There were a lot of other factors. That's just one factor in the decline. But the reality is that it was, in fact, a factor. The last one to close the doors was a company called London Town Manufacturing. London Town made raincoats. There was a time in the 1960s and 70s where 5 of the 6 men's raincoats being worn in America were made by London Town. That business also went overseas. By then, that company was no longer locally owned. And the parting shot from the company owners was very simple. They simply said, as they closed the doors on the factory, American workers had better get used to lower wages. And that's how it came to an end in the big leagues. Now, I know that these other panelists have other things to say, and they probably have some corrections for me. Nobody's perfect up here, but I'm sorry, I took 11 minutes on you.
Close, you got it, Jack. That was really fascinating. Thank you for the overview. Next, we'll hear from Sally. But before we do, I wonder, I did not make my sweater, and I think it's probably fair to guess that Jack did not knit his sweater either.
You didn't knit that sweater?
No, but both Sally and Stacy created the absolutely stunning garments they're wearing. Would you stand up, both of you, so everybody can see? Look at that. Gorgeous, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
All right, Sally, you're up.
Can you set your timer?
I'll tell you a little bit before I get into it. The fabric came from Haas Tailoring Company, one of the huge manufacturers of menswear here in Maryland. They're still around. I don't know exactly what they're doing now, but I grew up in Italy, and the way we got to America was that Mr. Haas wrote contract to bring us here because he needed skilled workers. So my mom and her sisters went to work at his factory, and we were at his home, and he just felt, he was very enamored with the talents of my family. So the fabric, and anyway, and not just that, my family was heavily friends with many of the other factories here. We had the Piccinini company that was here that also made suits, Haas Tailoring, Grief, Lebo. So we were friends with the owners, and as a little kid, I remember that with Piccinini, he would take us in his Cadillac, and my sister and I were so tiny, we thought, oh my God, this was so wonderful. So they had that kind of relationship with the industry. So this fabric came from Haas Tailoring. At the end of the season, they would sell all their leftover fabrics to the employees, and they would open up the doors to outsiders too for their sample sales. So we'd go in there and buy whatever you wanted at a discount price. So it's probably about 60 years old. The fabric. I made it a while ago, but as I always say, it's if you do suits, it's a classic. You can wear it forever. But let me tell you a little bit about the garment loft here, because that's what I'm supposed to be talking about. It didn't happen overnight. The museum opened, I think, in '77, right?
We moved here in '81, but yes.
And so it's from 81 till the garment loft opened in 1998. That's the time span that we all worked on the project to make it to come to life. And the way I just didn't end up on the doorsteps of the Baltimore Museum of Industry. I have to tell you about that process of how I got here, which is really fascinating. I studied fashion design in Maryland Institute College of Art, graduated from there, and then eventually went on to Hopkins to get a degree in higher education. But I worked in the industry. I got hired right away by Glenbrook Coat Company. We made here in Baltimore, we made all the fur-lined coats, and we also did suits for the House of Dior, Chanel, and Saint Laurent. And that was all done here in Baltimore. The gentleman who trained me worked with, if you all know who Coco Chanel is? Well, he's the gentleman who trained me worked with Chanel. So between what I learned from my family who worked in the industry here in America, and Mr. School and Mr. Jolet, who owned Glenbrook Coat Company, he sort of passed down Chanel's techniques to me, and of course, so anyway, I worked in the industry, but I always wanted to teach. So after I felt I'd been in the industry long enough to learn my trade, I went and applied for a job at Baltimore City Community College here it was in downtown Baltimore, not far from here on Lombard Street. After Micah closed their fashion program, they opened a fashion design program, and I got hired because of my industry experience, because I didn't have much of teaching experience. So across from the college was the Joseph Bank Company. So I had just been hired. I hadn't been at this college too long, and I'm sitting in my office and I'm contemplating all the curriculum development I have to do, because there wasn't much of anything. There was a skeleton curriculum, and I wanted to make sure that the students learned their technicals and their couture techniques. And in comes this little lady, petite lady, very thin, pretty, middle-aged. I was young, so to me she was probably ancient at that time. And I could tell she was wearing a Bank suit, because Banks had just started going into ladies' wear, and she said, "We are right across the road from you, the street from you, and you and I need to work together." And I said, "Well, who are you?" And she said, "I am Harriet Banks, and I think she was the vice president of the company." I said, "Oh," and I'm like, "Oh, I'll work with you, anything that'll get my students jobs." And so eventually we started working together. She said, "I want you to come to the factory and meet our head designer, because I want to start hiring your students." And I said, "Oh, great." I was young, and I was always for, let's, get the kids, the students out there in the industry to work, to learn more than they sitting here in the classroom. So I went over there and met with Mr. Stamponi, their head designer, and he took me through the design room, and I could see it was all male. There were no women working in the design room. And then he took me into the factory. That was a different story. It was mostly more women. The men were running the pressing machines. So the first thing he did is gotta remember this was 40 years ago, I was young, and he said, I wanna introduce you to this nice young man, I think you two can go out together. And I said, I got a boyfriend, don't worry about that, no. The factories were such matchmaking places, it was unbelievable. As they worked, they matchmaked everything. And my mother ended up marrying me off, and the marriage lasted, it's been over 40 some years. She fixed up a lot of couples and their relationship. No divorces at all. So anyway, as they were working, they were marrying off people, trading recipes and things like that. So long story short, I went around the factory, and then of course I sat down with Mr. Stampone, and he said, I want to hire some of your students. I said, great, I can, send you the top talent I have. He said, well, it's got to be a male. Now, this was 40 years ago, so the Me Too movement had not happened. So I said, oh, but even then I said, okay, male. And I asked why, he said, well, they got to lift these big heavy bolts of fabric, and the girls just can't do that. And I said, okay, well, at that point I said, well, at least I'll get a male student hired. But he did. We hired our student. They hired our students to actually work in the fashion design room, which is unheard of. Usually they put you out in the sewing floor. So after that, Mrs. Banks had other ideas. She goes, well, I want you to meet some people. And I said, oh, great, maybe more internships for my students' jobs. She said, I want you to meet Ann Steele. She's the deputy director of the Baltimore Museum of Industry. And to be honest with you, at that point, I had never heard about the museum. I said, what? Really? There's a Baltimore Museum of Industry? Oh yeah, she said they got sewing machines and things like that they're collecting, and I really want you to work with her and the director of the museum, Dennis Zambala. And I said, great. And the first project that we did is my students recreated costumes so that if you go into the canning industry, you would see what the people that worked in that industry, what they were wearing, and that kind of stuff. The garment loft that still hadn't happened. It was still in the beginning stages. We were thinking about it and all that, so we did that. Eventually, I got a collection of really top designer garments donated, and we had an opening here. We had an exhibit that ran here for a month. But behind the scenes, we were always working with the museum, with the director and the assistant director on bringing the garment loft to life. And so it was really Harriet Banks who spearheaded all of that. Banks donated a lot of the machines that are in that garment loft. Haas Tailoring donated some machines too, and there was a uniform company. And I think Angela Bombace, who was the head of the union, her son, I think he donated money to get it up and off the ground. But it took many, many years. It didn't happen overnight. It was over a 20-year process of collecting machines, trying to convince the city to give them money for this exhibit, which to Dennis's, the former director's credit, and the deputy directors, they really all worked together, and Mrs. Banks. So we got the tables, everything that you see in the garment loft. If you haven't gone through it and you go through it, all of that was donated by these different companies. We had an opening night. All the heads of the companies came, but what just kind of stuck to me all these years was the workers came. They were here, the people that were running the sewing machines. They were showing the other guests how to run the machines and all of that, and they were so proud of that garment loft. And I'm hoping in the, maybe in the future that we can really honor them, because right now it's been mostly the people who donated the machines, the heads of the companies. I think we now need to honor the garment workers, because they're the ones that are behind the scenes that made those machines run. When the exhibit opened, all of the machines were in operating order. People could come in and actually, with guidance, sit down and sew on the machines. We had a little disagreement with the former director because he wanted people to come in, or school groups to come in and make men's ties as a project. And I made men's ties, and it took about 10 of us to convince him that men's ties they're not easy to do at all. I could probably sew a suit jacket faster than I can make a man's tie. It's that complicated. So, and then so we sent him to Restivo Ties to go see how the process was made. When he came back, he said, "I guess you're all right." Ladies, you're right. And then he said, "Well, what about vests?" I said, "Oh my God, now we're gonna do vests, you know." So that kind of eventually, all those ideas kind of died, and the director and assistant director left in I guess 2000. I think that's when they moved on to Detroit. That's where they are. I think they're still there now. I mean, he's probably retiring now. So, but you know, my affiliation with the museum has off and on has continued, and I think it's reviving itself again now. So. Anyway, well, thank you that I did I talk too much?
No,
I'm Italian, I talk too much.
Okay, I just want to say thank you, and here's Stacy. I have nothing to say yet, but we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions.
Hello everyone. So I do many things. I think most designers do, just because we're creative, but currently I am the Head of Innovation for what I consider the last factory here in Baltimore. We have over 36 full-time sewing machine operators. We've created garments for Adidas, Champion, Diana Furstenberg. So I'm gonna go into a bit of that part of it, like where it leads off, but I think to follow the timeline, in 1976, when there's a mass exodus, I guess, in the 70s, when the factories were closing, and Phil Spector, who's the owner of the factory I worked for, he, like myself, probably around my age, was left without a job. It was his job to tell the sewers that don't come back on Monday, and then he had to, close down the factory, get rid of the machines, and so with 2 sewing machines, he was like, well, I need a job, and so he rebuilt what I consider what's left of the industry. Now, my journey was just behind the factory as a child, which is kind of small world. I was moved to Baltimore. My grandfather actually set up a nonprofit here at Paul's Place. I'm half Indonesian, half American, and it wasn't until I was in school and I needed a part-time job, started through that fashion journey. But I actually moved to London, studied there, was there for 7 years. And then I moved to Bali, Indonesia for 3 years, and that's really inspired my work, but also my connection to manufacturing, and also the side of the artisan community and the craftsmanship, which is being lost in our industry. And so when I returned to Baltimore after 10 years away from the United States, I was connected to Sally DeMarco, because I was told that, Baltimore used to have a garment industry, and through my youth, I never saw it. There wasn't any factories, there weren't, fabric suppliers around like you see in New York. So that's why I moved to London. That's why I went to Indonesia. So then Sally connected me to Phil Spector, and I interviewed, and funny enough, it was just behind my childhood home. So the factory went around the world and ended up in literally my backyard. We do tours with the Baltimore Heritage Society because there's this fascination that they can't believe that we exist. So when I first went to the factory, the floor kind of shakes a little, and I love it. It's like six-ish in the morning, and that means industry is alive. It means that how do you sustain industry? It's by utilizing those skills. But the scary thing is I've been there about 3 years, and in that time, 2 of what I consider industry legends have passed away suddenly. Those skills are not transferred on. There is no progression plan. Not to discount Under Armour, but we visited their innovation department, the Lighthouse, and I think at the time they had 9 sewing machine operators, and now I believe they have 2. So the future of the fashion industry does not include people, at least stateside, onshore. At the factory, we were invited to Washington to represent U.S. manufacturing, and with the undersecretary to talk about the needs. And I kind of sat in the back because I wasn't, the president of the company, and there was a panel of 7 of them, all men. And the discussion was about how do we mechanize, how do we compete, how do we drop the total landed cost of goods. That means once it arrives here in the United States, how cheaply can we do it? And so they kept going on and saying, we need new machines, we need this and that. And it wasn't until the end that the undersecretary asked me, what about you? What about you as a young person? And I said that I care about industry, I care about the people, I care about the jobs that we're creating. So to mechanize it is to take away our humanity of industry. And that I didn't say it then, of course, out of respect, but that I don't want to be a part of. What I saw in Indonesia was communities coming together, making by hand, sitting together, drinking a coffee, and not counting the minutes that they're in the bathroom or counting the seconds that they move a fabric through the machine. We've lost it. We've lost the reason why I think it matters. And so I spent 5 years here back in the US hosting workshops, talking about this discussion about a Baltimore fashion renaissance. I don't know what that looks like. And so that was our discussion with artists, with entrepreneurs, with fashion designers. And what I've started to see through this time is that it's not the large volume of sewers. The United States, according to the employment the Bureau of Labor, there's only 47,000 sewing machine operators across the entire United States. I don't know statistically, but I would assume that one state could have covered that amount. And so what we're seeing as well is they're going back to that handover. There's no handover. And the wage is actually lowering in the United States despite the minimum wage rising. So what that means is they're getting squeezed all the time, even at that price point. So who's going to want to work in industry? And so the management level, I believe the average wage for a management level person in industry in a factory is $22 an hour. How in the world do you have an education and a student loan and then care enough for industry to create a factory? So that's where we've completely shot ourselves in the foot. So the next thing is, who's responsible? The person who pays the bill, who buys the garment, who's accepting that $5 t-shirt and telling their girlfriend, oh my God, I got this for $5. I can do the math, you could do the math, but that slave labor wage is there. And so we're excited that we're consuming so much. And then the last place I bought a vintage garment before going back to Indonesia from Du Bois, across from Montgomery Ward. And it was used to be a textile place, and then they went into vintage garments, and then that turned into a storage unit. We have more storage unit systems being expanded in the United States than we have manufacturers. So then I had to really kind of take a step back and think about, outside of the factory, all those lives, all those jobs, all those workers, who has a voice for them? And when people come to the factory, they're always asking, well, why don't you have Americans working there? Because we exported our skill. So if we were to ask someone, come on, try out, we need sewers. We're booked out for an entire year. Our factory is at full production capacity. We are always busy. We're turning people away left and right, but we can't find workers. So you put someone behind a sewing machine, they can't work at that speed, they can't work at that quality, yet we have to, our examiners make more than someone who works at Joann Fabric stocking boxes. So when you compare that to someone who's making such a little wage, how do you compete? So the solution is, we're seeing it through innovations. So we have research centers that are creating new things in textiles, who are working in the medical community, who are creating solutions through fabric, and whether that is a compression top, or that's wearable technology, or that's for an MS patient that has weight systems built into it. There are different ways, but it's not through volume in the United States, and it's not through cost. It's going to be with products that are hitting a niche market. The other part to it is, well, who's gonna sew it up? You can have the most amazing garment, but if you don't have someone to sew it, then you don't have a product. So we have, in the audience, we have Nicole, who is developing her own atelier, where I am reshoring my own personal collection, Elsa Fitzgerald, which means my garments that I made in Indonesia, we're bringing it back to the United States. I'm one designer. And so that is maybe not a large volume, but you multiply that by the number of entrepreneurs that are choosing to create something unique and are doing smaller batch, but enough to keep those hands moving at a quality that matters. The other part is cultural identity, and so we have Miss Nori in the audience who is training me in a traditional Indonesian garment. I don't think a single kabaya garment, which you'll see in the loft, is made in the United States. So that will be exciting, where it used to be, let's go send our manufacturing to Asia and have them do it as cheaply as possible. Well then, let's make some Asian garments in the United States and make it as expensive as possible with the best quality fabrics and something that you can have pride in, and then send it back to Indonesia with love from the United States. So this conversation has now moved into this program that all four of us are a part of called SEW Bromo. SEW Bromo is about having people in industry training people about industry. So we have workshops about how to manufacture in the United States, but from Nicole and my point of view, we're in it right now, so we see what's happening and creating pathways for that. We found that we have educators that are coming to us because the educators in the fashion schools, they're no longer working in industry, and the industry is moving faster than the textbooks and even blog posts can print. And a lot of this information is very confidential. It's not publicly made known. And then we have the other side, which is the life enrichment. So Ibu Nuri, we've been including Indonesian culture. So when we're doing like our sewing sessions, she's creating Indonesian food, and we're playing Indonesian music and showing this kind of cultural relationship with fashion, artisan, and handmade craftsmanship. And then with Sally, she's launching, we're launching the Draping Basics course in April. So that fine needlework, that level of sewing that you no longer see in your garments, perhaps you don't want to pay the price to buy it, but maybe you'll pay the price to learn to make it. And that's what I see about the future of industry. It's a matter of coming together, doing something you love, and including the people so that there is the humanity behind it. And that's an industry that I'm proud to be a part of, and I'm thankful for this museum for allowing me to be able to share that, and for Sally for passing on an industry that matters. And I hope that we can carry this forward, and we're going to invite you in the garment loft to see some of the garments that we're working on with the reshoring of the manufacturing of Elsa Fitzgerald, but also with some of the traditional Indonesian garment, the kabaya. So thank you.
Thank you. I don't know about you all, but I thought that was fantastic. I really learned a lot, and I especially appreciate your passion, Stacy, for being responsible consumers and doing what we can to bring industry back.